Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the weekly webinar. I'm Kelly G. Loeb, your weekly webinar host, and I have 1:59 actually on my clock, but I'm excited to be with y'all today and have a wonderful conversation. So thanks for joining in. As you can see on the slide, our speaker for today is Dr. Russell Swerdlow, and the topic is diet, nutrition, and Alzheimer's disease. I know there's lots of interest and energy around those things. So we'll start here with just a moment. Remind everyone to keep yourselves muted. And if you have a question, feel free to use the chat function. I'll monitor that. And I'm sure Dr. Swerdlow will be happy to answer your questions after his presentation. So with that, I'll also remind you that you can use the closed captioning function. At the very bottom of your screen, there's a button that says CC. So if you'd like closed captioning, take advantage of that. Thank you, Dr. Swerdlow, for having your slides ready. I'm going to tell the folks a little bit about you, and then I'll hand the reins over to you. So, Dr. Russell Swerdlow is the director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and a neuroscientist who is internationally known for his work on mitochondrial dysfunction in neurodegenerative diseases. And today, Dr. Swerdlow will talk about the role that diet and nutrition play in Alzheimer's disease and what you can do to make healthy lifestyle choices. So, with that said, Dr. Swerdlow, I yield the floor to you. Thank you for being here.
Okay, well, thanks, Kelly, and hi, everyone. I thought I would talk a little bit about diet and nutrition. A lot of people are interested about in how they might be able to use diet to benefit their brain. Certainly, I am. I thought I would maybe kind of sum up a bit of what we know about this topic. So, people, scientists and have looked into this idea about, can we influence brain health through what we eat and through our diet and nutrition. And let's see here. Yeah, so and there are a couple of things that kind of come up repeatedly in the literature and kind of have sort of informed thinking of how we might be able to use diet in Alzheimer's or to prevent Alzheimer's. So one thing that the field has known about for a long time has to do with B vitamins. So there are certain B vitamin deficiencies that we've known, that neurologists have known about for decades. Having a vitamin B12 deficiency can adversely affect cognition. So that's something we routinely check on people who are having memory complaints. But the B vitamins do play a role in our cells. They're responsible for certain metabolic reactions. When those metabolic reactions aren't working well, there's a compound called homocysteine that can build up in cells, which maybe could be harmful. And through some complex chemistry, B vitamins can affect even how certain genes are expressed. So it's been well recognized that B vitamin deficiencies can affect cognition, but it's never really been shown that by getting super high doses of these vitamins that has any benefit. So being too low is not good, but being above the limits of low does it get better the higher you get? That's never been shown. And then there's been a lot of interest in oxidative stress, free radicals in diseases like Alzheimer's. And we all know that there are certain vitamins that are touted to be antioxidant vitamins, so they help get rid of free radicals. And the ones that we tend to think of most are vitamin E and vitamin C. And so that prompted different groups to look at vitamin E and C intake, antioxidant vitamin intake, to see if that affected Alzheimer's risk. And there was one study that was done in the Netherlands called the Rotterdam study that basically, it was an epidemiology study that where it looked like, people who have a lot of vitamin E and C in their diets, they may have a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's. With these epidemiology studies, they're good at pointing out correlations, but they don't really tell you why there's a correlation. Maybe it could be that all the antioxidants in the diet were warding off Alzheimer's, or maybe people who weren't getting Alzheimer's were just eating more antioxidant-rich foods. And there's another study done in Utah called the Cache County study. In this one, they found something a little bit different, which was people who took a lot of vitamin E and C supplements seemed to have a lower risk of getting Alzheimer's disease than those who weren't taking vitamin E and C supplements. Again, you don't know why there is the association, but there was the association. And based on studies like these, there were groups that actually did what we call randomized studies, where you take a bunch of people, let's say with Alzheimer's, and half of them you put on a lot of vitamin E, and half of them you put on a placebo. And in two of those studies, the group that was given vitamin E, in this case 2,000 units a day of vitamin E, actually seemed to, these are Alzheimer's patients, and they seemed to decline less than the group that got the placebo. So these were actually, I guess you would call these positive studies, but for a variety of reasons, no one really ever got that excited about prescribing vitamin E for Alzheimer's. And then polyphenols also have antioxidant properties, and they actually have other properties as well. And foods that we think of as having more polyphenol in them are grapes. And this would be like red grapes. So it's in like the red skin of the grape. So red wine has a lot of polyphenols, whereas white wine much less. Blueberries, what's causing the blue in the blueberry, it has polyphenols in it. And then, but also olive oil, nuts, cocoa, green tea, and there's something called EGCG, which is found in green. It's a chemical found in green tea. So, people have looked to see whether, intake of these polyphenol compounds may lower the risk of Alzheimer's. And the associations are there, but these things have never really been shown in any kind of clinical trial to either reduce Alzheimer's risk or to slow Alzheimer's decline. Similarly, there's been a lot of interest in polyunsaturated fatty acids, and that came from the realization, in the cardiac world, that saturated fats that can increase cholesterol and could enhance vascular disease. Well, maybe those could be bad for the heart. Maybe they can be bad for the brain, and that got people interested in well, can you substitute polyunsaturated fatty acids for saturated fatty acids, and might that have a protective effect? And you get polyunsaturated fatty acids in things like fish oil, or eating fish, or imbibing fish oil. And like I was talking about with polyphenols and different vitamins, you would see these epidemiology studies that would suggest, those who eat more fish and have a higher intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids, that maybe they're less likely to get Alzheimer's disease over a 5-year period than people who aren't, eating a lot of PUFAs. But there's not been a clinical trial where you put them head to head and said, yep, fish oil really makes a difference. So there's some tantalizing data that would be consistent with the possibility, but no one's really been able to show it at a confident level. And then there have been studies with other nutrients like lipoic acid, which is important in different aspects of metabolism. And there's some supportive data, but nothing definite. methylxanthines, which are, caffeine in coffee. Similarly, there's these epidemiology associations, but the data for doing it doesn't really go much past that. Okay, so people have thought about sugar. Yeah, and that, people started to think about that when it became clear that the way the brain uses sugar in Alzheimer's is different than if you don't have Alzheimer's. So people started to ask questions about, how much sugar is in the diet. Does that affect Alzheimer's risk? And if, the epidemiology study said, yeah, people who tend to eat lower carbohydrate diets, seem to be at a lower risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. But has anyone shown that a low carb diet pattern may affect decline in Alzheimer's, or that it can actually prevent Alzheimer's? I'll come back to that later. That's a complex question. There was also a study with one way to get less sugar is by caloric restriction. There was a study in 2009, this study by Witt et al., which found that people on a calorically restricted diet, that their performance on memory testing, on a test of memory, improved over people who are on a regular diet. But very few people want to be on a calorically restricted diet. But sugar's effects can be complex, right? Because how much sugar and how much carbohydrate you eat influences other things too. So eating too much carbohydrate can influence some inflammation pathways. How much sugar you eat affects insulin, and insulin may be relevant to Alzheimer's and brain health. And of course, if you take in so much carbohydrate that you start to get sugar intolerant or glucose intolerance, that's been associated with a higher risk of Alzheimer's. Okay, people have started to think a lot about the gastrointestinal tract itself, and one thing that comes up quite a bit now is the microbiome. These are bacteria that live in our guts, and they're not passive. They help process the foods that we eat, and what they process can generate molecules that get absorbed into our bodies, into our bloodstreams, and go to places like our brains. And some of the molecules that the bacteria in our gut generate, certainly do go to our brain and can be used by our brain. So, which has led to the thought that maybe if you're producing something bad, maybe it can hurt the brain, and if you're producing something good, maybe it can help the brain. And so, can we manipulate the microbiome to help or hurt us? And we can certainly manipulate our microbiome through what we eat, but these studies are still in their relative infancy. One thing I would point out is with the gastrointestinal tract is gastric acidity. As people tend to get older, their gastric acidity tends to decline, and this can reduce vitamin B12 absorption. So that takes us back to what I was saying before about vitamin B12. A lot of older people may have low vitamin B12 levels because they don't absorb it as well as they used to when they were younger. Okay, so all these studies about nutrients got people thinking about, are there different diets that maybe we can recommend to people for Alzheimer's prevention? And so based on what I've been talking about, I was talking about people who are interested in antioxidants and polyphenols and lowering sugar. And there were some people who basically said, hey, there is this kind of diet which people tend to eat in these Mediterranean countries. We'll call it the Mediterranean diet, that kind of covers these angles. The diet pattern in some of these Mediterranean bordering countries, people would eat, a relatively high amount of veggies and fruits and nuts and less in unrefined grains. And they would often eat less red and white meat and less processed dairy. These diet patterns could be high in fat or low in fat, but if you look at the fat that people were eating, it tended to have less in terms of saturated fatty acids because there was less, especially red meat intake, and more polyunsaturated fatty acids because there was a lot of olive oil and fish and nuts being eaten. And then, especially like the French, who would drink a lot of red wine, which I mentioned is high in polyphenols, and just by eating the fruits and veggies, you get higher antioxidant intake. So people said, this Mediterranean diet kind of covers several of the angles that the nutrition scientists are interested in. Let's look and see. Let's do the epidemiology. And there have been pretty consistent reports of populations that eat these Mediterranean diets seem to have a lower rate of Alzheimer's disease. Whether it's due to the diet or not is unclear, but it's consistent with the possibility that maybe like a Mediterranean diet may be reasonable to consider for prevention. Have there been any convincing studies that go beyond the epidemiology association type of study? And there have been 2 studies, but which did report positive results, in which they randomized people who were to a Mediterranean diet or to a non-Mediterranean diet, and over several years looked to see how people did on cognitive tests. And these studies in 2013 and in 2015 were reported to be like, if you put people on a Mediterranean diet, they have a lower risk over the next couple of years of developing Alzheimer's. But the problem is that when the studies were subsequently analyzed, people pointed out, wait, hold on a second. You didn't do the studies the way you said you did the studies. You said you randomized the patients, and you really didn't randomize the patients in the usual way, which led to these supportive studies actually being retracted from the literature. So they were kind of flawed studies, but the investigators who retracted the studies, they then took the studies and they said, we went back and we reanalyzed, and we think even though we did the studies incorrectly, we still think we were right, and they republished the studies. But so you kind of have to take it for what it's worth. Another specific diet that people have talked about is something called the DASH diet. DASH is an acronym that stands for Dietary Approaches to Hypertension. And it was people got interested in terms of Alzheimer's because it's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of like the Mediterranean diet. So people said, well, there have been these studies of a DASH diet in people with heart conditions. Maybe we can go back and look at those data and see if we can learn anything about how maybe it affect how cognition did in people in those studies. And so this DASH diet, which in some ways is kind of like the Mediterranean diet, they went back and they said, people who kind of eat this DASH diet pattern, they do seem to have a lower risk of getting Alzheimer's too, just like people on the Mediterranean diet. So the data aren't as there's less data, but and then some of the studies have said, people who eat kind of a DASH-like diet pattern have a lower risk of Alzheimer's, but other studies have said, no, we don't see that. So, but this is something that's certainly been advocated as something that people can consider if they wanted to, roll the dice with a diet. And then there were some people who said, well, let's try to combine a Mediterranean diet and a DASH diet together. And they created something or defined something called the MIND diet, which stands for Mediterranean DASH Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. So this is just trying to take the greatest hits from a Mediterranean diet and from a DASH diet and combine them into one diet. And there's even less data on this type of intervention, but what people have done is to go back and say, okay, let's follow these populations that and have them do food diaries, and we'll look and see, are they eating like a MIND like diet pattern or not? And and again, you get this epidemiology association that those who are eating these kinds of foods tend to have a lower risk of Alzheimer's. The problem, again, is you don't know causality. You don't know, why. It could be, there could be a lot of reasons why people eat certain kinds of foods that may really be affecting or reflecting what their Alzheimer's risk is over the next several years. So it's hard to say that the diet is actually protecting them. It could be that they're just further from the Alzheimer's cliff, and maybe that has something to do with why they're eating that way. So I told you I would come back to this idea of fat in the diet. Then that brings us to the ketogenic diet. And so yeah, there's really no data that I'm familiar with looking at ketogenic diets as all for Alzheimer's prevention. There are a number of studies looking at ketogenic diets for trying to improve cognition in people with memory problems, either who have subjective memory problems or mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's. So ketogenic diet is a very low carbohydrate diet, so it's trying to cut out sugar. And it's trying to replace all the carbs that you're cutting out with fat, preferably polyunsaturated fat as opposed to saturated fat. So and there's now been 5 of these studies that they're all very small studies, but they've all found that people who went on these ketogenic diets, that their performance on memory tests seemed to improve while they were on the ketogenic diet. So there's a lot of reasons conceptually to propose that a ketogenic diet may have an impact on brain function. So the data so far are tantalizing, but they're all small studies. We're actually doing a much larger study now, trying to get a more confident answer about the possibility of a ketogenic diet improving memory test performance. So based on this kind of review of the literature, what I can say is that much of what we know about, or much of what we say about the ability of diet to influence Alzheimer's risk is based on association. So the thing with association means it could be, there could really be something there or not. If you don't want to be a nihilist, you can say, well, there may be a benefit there, but we don't really have enough to make confident conclusions. Some of the data come from studies with caveats. So the studies may be small, or maybe the studies were not done in a rigorous way, which also basically says, there could be benefits, but we can't say for sure. Some of the studies, the effect sizes or the amount of benefit seen was also very small. So, when we see small effects, we can't be as confident about what we saw as when we see large effects. And then some, just like with many things in the literature, sometimes we see positive studies and negative studies, which also affects our ability to make confident conclusions. But when you boil down all of this, what are probably the safest things that we can recommend? Well, I think we can say with pretty good confidence that it's probably best to avoid malnutrition. Okay, so avoid nutrient deficiencies. If you're deficient in B12, take a B12 supplement. It's pretty common sense, right? You don't want to be malnourished. It's probably worthwhile, to the extent that one can, to try to minimize obesity. Having too much adipose can contribute to glucose intolerance, and glucose intolerance is basically a sign that at least some parts of the body are struggling to handle issues of nutrition, in this case overnutrition. And it's possible that struggle can involve the brain as well. So to the extent that you can avoid glucose intolerance, that's probably a good thing to do in the long run. Another common sense recommendation is don't eat too much processed junk food. And and finally, again, it's common sense. Eating healthy foods over junk foods probably can't hurt you. So those are like the most conservative recommendations, I guess, one can make from all of this. So this is just a table that kind of sums up positive dietary factors versus negative dietary factors. So the data suggests these things might be helpful, but none of them are proven. Okay. And basically, I'm not going to read this. It's all the things that I've been talking about. And then for those of you, if anyone wants to be a pioneer and try out a particular kind of diet, you can look at, there are things that sum up the differences between these three main diets that I told you about: the Mediterranean diet versus a DASH diet versus a MIND diet. And then I'll just throw in a plug for our ketogenic diet study. So this is a study that it's not an Alzheimer's prevention study, it's an Alzheimer's treatment study. And people who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, although mild cognitive impairment, will consider people with mild cognitive impairment. If you enter into the study, you'll end up being randomized either to a straight ahead ketogenic diet or to a heart healthy diet, which again is kind of not that much different from, let's say, a Mediterranean diet. It's supposed to be good for the heart. So whatever you get randomized to, the idea is that maybe it's going to help you and your health. We'd like to think that, but it's going to help us learn whether that's in fact the case, and whether a ketogenic diet or a heart healthy diet may help memory test performance in people with Alzheimer's. So we're very actively recruiting for that study. If you know anyone who has Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment and may want to be in a diet study, this is a really good one to consider. So I think I'll stop there. I'll stop sharing my screen. Let's see if there are any questions that have been popping up. See a couple of things in the chat. What do we have here? Yeah, well, so I didn't say much about protein. Less is known about the role of protein in brain health. There's a lot of interest in people losing, can eating protein help people from losing muscle mass as they get older? So that's a part of the literature that I didn't review. It's a complex area, but I'm not sure. I didn't come across any studies that said that there's an optimal amount of protein to eat. Okay, and then Joe Nelson says, sounds like you might be saying that with the exception of B12, there is no conclusive evidence of any diet or nutrient effects on AD risk. What I would say, Joe, is that there's no conclusive evidence of any diet or nutrient effect on AD risk. There's a lot of supportive stuff. Nothing is. I wouldn't say anything is 100%. And I'm not saying that having a low B12 level causes Alzheimer's. What I'm saying is that people who have a low vitamin B12 level can have issues with cognition. So if but with any malnutrition, really, if scurvy or B12 deficiency or pellagra, which is niacin deficiency, any of these deficiencies can cause someone not to be sharp mentally. Probably the most common one in our society is B12 deficiency. Okay. And then that's kind of a related question. How much B12 should seniors have? I would say whatever is needed to keep your level from being low. You know, the only way you know if you're low or not would be if you have your vitamin B12 level checked. So that's something that, you know, if anyone was interested, you can ask your physician to check your vitamin B12 level. And yeah, I guess if my vitamin B12 level was below the limits of normal, or what's reported as normal, I might go to the supermarket and pick up a bottle of B12 and start taking it. But you can't really know what your vitamin B12 level is until you've been checked for it. What are your thoughts on probiotics? Hey, Jim. The probiotics is complicated because it might be affecting our microbiome, or presumably it would affect our microbiome. And the microbiome are probably important or probably relevant. So yeah, I would say that probiotics may be relevant, just to the extent that a lot of the things I'm talking about may be relevant. We just don't know, but yeah, this whole idea that you know, the microbiome, which is modifiable, may be doing something that's relevant. It certainly makes it intriguing and worth studying. Okay. Physicians don't know what normal B12 is. Please give a number. Well, it's hard, depending on what laboratory is doing the test. The different labs will have different ranges and different cutoffs. So one lab may have a cutoff of 180, some labs may have a cutoff of 280. You kind of have to look and see what the lower limit is on whoever, coming from whoever did the test. Yeah. But usually, you know, it's going to be around 200-ish is probably going to be around the cutoff. So I think that's all the questions, which brings us right up to about 2:30. Wow, perfect timing.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Swerdlow. You used the phrase tantalizing data in some of your comments, and I know I certainly felt that way hearing about the research that's happening. And I also feel like the next food opportunity I have today will include some wonderful green leafy vegetables. So thanks for that tip. Thank you everyone for participating today. You can see on the screen that there's a slide about how you can connect to the ADRC to participate in a study, how to spread the word to your friends that might not know about My Alliance. And of course, we always have opportunities for giving so that we can support this great research that Dr. Swerdlow and others are leading. So with that, we'll wrap up, except I do see one last question in the chat about what the AW in the slides mean.
Oh, AW is an abbreviation for associated with.
Associated with, perfect. Okay. Well, that brings us to our time today. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And next week, we'll be talking about our LEAP program, Lifestyle Empowerment for Alzheimer's Prevention, and Rachel Sandoval will be our speaker. So I hope you'll join us. If you have any questions between now and then, please feel free to give us a call, send an email. And again, Dr. Swerdlow, thank you so much for your time today and for all the great work you're doing. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.
Great job, Kelly.
Thank you.